Imagine standing in the courtyard of a European abbey, right? And you were watching a monk just toss stacks of meticulously kept scientific notes into a roaring bonfire.
Oh, it's such an agonizing visual.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking pages of complex mathematical calculations, decades of weather observations, intricate biological records, all just turning into ash and floating away.
Yeah.
And the wild part is the guy throwing them into the fire isn't like an angry mob or anything. It's the newly appointed abbot, and he's just trying to clean out his predecessor's desk to settle this really petty local tax dispute.
Right, he's just doing admin work.
Exactly. He has absolutely no idea that he is incinerating the personal files of the man who literally cracked the code of biology.
Which is just, I mean, one of the biggest tragedies in the history of science. We lost an unimaginable wealth of primary research in that fire.
Yeah.
But the work that did survive, which was, published in this super obscure journal decades earlier, it eventually changed how humanity understands life itself.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into the life, the experiments, and the really intense statistical scandals of Gregor Mendel.
Mm-hmm.
And our mission today isn't just to, review the high school biology you probably forgot. We are pulling from a massive stack of biographical and historical sources to uncover the human story here.
The story of an obscure working-class innovator.
Exactly. A guy who completely bypassed the scientific elite, was entirely ignored by his peers for 75 years, and then, posthumously sparked a massive scientific controversy.
Yeah, it's quite a ride.
So let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like you were doing your absolute best, most brilliant work, but literally nobody was paying attention, like you were just shouting into a void?
Oh, totally.
Right. Well, if so, Gregor Mendel is your patron saint.
He really is the ultimate patron saint of the unrecognized genius. And to really grasp the stakes of his work, we have to understand the scientific mindset of the 19th century.
Okay.
Because before Mendel, the prevailing theory of heredity was this really fuzzy concept called blending inheritance.
Blending inheritance.
Yeah. The scientific consensus was basically that traits just mix together permanently.
Oh, like mixing paint in a bucket.
Yeah.
Like if you pour red paint and white paint together, you get pink paint.
Right.
And you can never, pull that original red or white paint back out.
That was exactly the assumption. But Mendel completely dismantled that idea. I mean, he replaced that vague notion with a mathematically rigorous framework of discrete, invisible factors.
What we now call genes.
Exactly. He proved that biology wasn't just this messy blend of fluids, but an actual system of predictable, calculable units.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because before we get into the famous Pea Plants, we really need to understand how this world-changing science ended up happening in, a monastery garden in Moravia, rather than a prestigious university in London or Paris.
Yeah, context is absolutely everything here. So he was born Johann Mendel in 1822 in a village in Silesia, which is part of the modern-day Czech Republic. And he came from a German-speaking farming family. They had lived and worked on that exact same farm for over 130 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
Right. So there was no inherited wealth, no legacy of academic prestige at all.
I was actually looking at his early life in the sources, and the financial strain just sounded agonizing. I mean, his younger sister, Teresia, actually sacrificed her own dowry to pay for his schooling.
Yeah, and that sacrifice weighed so heavily on him his entire life.
Well, yeah, bet.
He actually later paid that debt forward by supporting her 3 sons, 2 of whom ended up becoming doctors.
Oh, wow.
But that constant crushing financial pressure, that's a primary reason he took the path he did. He became an Augustinian friar, taking the name Gregor, specifically because the church would cover the cost of his education.
Yeah, he wrote that the monastic life spared him the perpetual anxiety about a means of livelihood.
Yeah.
Honestly, that is deeply relatable.
Oh, for sure.
Think about it in modern terms. Joining St. Thomas's Abbey was less about, isolating himself from the world and more like getting accepted into a fully funded tech fellowship.
Or a startup incubator.
Exactly. You get room, board, and the freedom to think.
Yeah.
Without constantly worrying about making rent.
And that analogy holds up perfectly because the Abbey was actually a major intellectual hub. The abbot at the time, Cyril Knapp, was super fascinated by agriculture and heredity.
So he was in the right place.
Exactly. Mendel was entering a community that actively encouraged empirical research. In 1851, the abbot even sent Mendel to the University of Vienna to get formal training.
And this is, the pivot point of the whole story, right?
Correct.
At Vienna, he studies physics under Christian Doppler.
Right, the guy who discovered the Doppler effect.
Yeah. So Mendel is absorbing this incredibly rigorous, mathematically driven, physics-based training. But then, despite this obvious brilliance, he takes the exam to become a certified high school teacher, and he fails.
He fails the oral portion in 1850.
And then he fails it again in 1856. I mean, how does a guy who literally fails his teaching exams twice end up redefining biology?
Well, the beautiful irony is that failing those exams is what kept him at the Abbey.
Oh, right.
Had he passed, he likely would have been sent off to some demanding teaching post that would have consumed all his time. Instead, he goes back to the monastery as a substitute teacher with access to a massive garden.
A huge garden.
And more importantly, he brought a totally alien methodology back with him. You see, traditional botanists of the 19th century were deeply qualitative.
Meaning what, exactly?
They would look at a plant and just note things like, oh, this leaf is somewhat broader, or this stem seems a bit taller.
So they were basically just writing nature poetry.
Exactly. They were describing things, not calculating them. But Mendel, thanks to his physics training under Doppler, approached the garden like a mathematician.
Okay.
He didn't care about a leaf being somewhat broader. He wanted to know the exact statistical probabilities of specific traits cascading down through thousands of generations.
Right.
It was a complete paradigm shift in how to observe nature.
Which brings us to the famous garden. So armed with this mathematical mindset, Mendel claims a 2-hectare plot at the Abbey and turns it into an unprecedented data collection machine.
The sheer scale of his operation is just mind-boggling for a single researcher in the 1850s. I mean, between 1856 and 1863, Mendel cultivated and manually tested roughly 28,000 pea plants.
28,000?
Yeah, the species Pisum sativum.
That's insane. And I have to bring in this incredible detail from our sources. So Mendel is out there for years meticulously designing these cross-pollination experiments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And his supportive abbot writes a letter mentioning that the local bishop actually giggled when he was told about Mendel's detailed genealogies of peas.
Oh, man.
Right. It's the ultimate example of doing complex, visionary data entry while your superiors think you're just enjoying a cute, harmless hobby.
It really must have looked absurd from the outside. But Mendel was tracking 7 very specific traits, things like plant height, whether the pod was inflated or constricted, the color of the unripe pod, flower position, and of course, most famously, whether the seed was round or wrinkled and whether its color was yellow or green.
So let's look at how he actually broke the universe open using seed color. Because earlier we talked about blending inheritance, the mixing paint theory.
Right, let's trace his exact steps. So Mendel took a true breeding yellow pea plant, which means its ancestors had only ever produced yellow peas, and he crossed it with a true breeding green pea plant.
Okay, so under the blending theory, the offspring should be like a yellowish-green chartreuse pea.
Exactly, but the first generation of offspring were entirely 100% yellow.
Wow.
The green trait just seemed to have vanished from existence.
Which, if he stopped there, he might have just assumed, yellow destroys green.
Right, and that is why the next step is his masterstroke. He took those first-generation yellow offspring and crossbred them with each other.
Okay.
And in the next generation, the green peas suddenly reappeared.
Just out of nowhere.
Yes, and they reappeared in a mathematically rigid ratio. Exactly 3 yellow peas for every 1 green pea.
So how does he interpret that? Because if the green comes back, obviously the paint hasn't mixed.
He realizes he is looking at the law of segregation. The traits are not blending, they are discontinuous, discrete units.
Okay, discrete units.
Yeah, and he coins the term dominant for the yellow trait, which actively masked the other, and recessive for the green trait, which was carried silently and passed along completely intact.
Okay, so to use a different analogy, instead of mixing paint, it's more like shuffling a deck of cards.
Yes, perfect.
Like you can shuffle a king of spades and a queen of hearts together. The king might be dominant and show up on top of the pile, hiding the queen. But the queen never merges with the king to become some weird new card. She stays a queen of hearts, just waiting in the deck until the next shuffle brings her back to the surface.
That perfectly captures his breakthrough, and he followed that up with the law of independent assortment.
Which is that?
He proved that the card for seed color is shuffled completely independently from the card for plant height. So a pea plant, being tall, has absolutely no bearing on whether its peas will be yellow or green.
Right. He called these discrete units invisible factors.
Yeah.
And Honestly, the timeline of this blows my mind. He deduces the existence of genes purely through probability math in the 1860s.
Yeah.
He couldn't see a chromosome. He didn't know what DNA was. In fact, our sources point out that the hunt to find the physical molecular reality of his specific 7p genes took over a century.
It really did.
Like the final 3 of his specific traits were only mapped to their exact genes in the year 2025.
I know, the modern discoveries are fascinating because they validate his math on a biochemical level. Take the trait for wrinkled versus round peas.
Okay.
In 2025, scientists finalized that this is caused by an insertion mutation in a gene known as PSSBE1.
Wait, hold on. For those of us who aren't geneticists, what does an insertion mutation actually do mechanically to make a pea wrinkled?
Well, think of a gene as an instruction manual for building an enzyme.
Okay, an instruction manual.
Right. An insertion mutation means an extra random string of DNA code gets jammed into the middle of those instructions.
Oh, I'm out.
Because of that extra junk code, the pea plant fails to produce a specific enzyme needed to form smooth, complex starches.
So it's missing a step.
Exactly. And without that starch, the pea retains too much water. So as it dries out, it shrivels up and becomes wrinkled.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. Mendel couldn't see the corrupted instruction manual, but his statistical model was so flawless that scientists in the 2020s are essentially just filling in the biochemical blanks of a map he drew 160 years ago.
Okay, so you would assume that writing the literal rule book for how life passes on its blueprints would make you an instant legend. I mean, he should have been the most famous scientist in Europe.
You'd think so, but the reality is deeply frustrating. Mendel presented his findings to the Natural History Society of Brno in 1865 and then published his paper, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, in 1866. The reaction from the broader scientific community was absolute deafening silence.
They just ignored it.
They completely misunderstood it. They viewed it as just a niche paper about plant hybridization, not some universal foundational theory of heredity.
Oh, man.
To put the obscurity into perspective, his paper was cited roughly 3 times in the subsequent 35 years.
Here's where the story gets really painful, though, because Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, just a few years before Mendel's paper.
Right.
And Darwin was facing intense criticism because his theory of evolution had a massive hole in it. He didn't have a mechanism for heredity.
Exactly.
Like, if beneficial traits just blended away like mixed paint, evolution couldn't work. Mendel's discrete units, that unblendable deck of cards, were the exact mathematical key Darwin was desperately looking for.
And historians agonize over this missed connection. If Darwin had read and grasped Mendel's paper, the entire field of evolutionary biology might have accelerated by half a century.
That is just wild to think about.
But instead, Mendel remained isolated. He did try to reach out to the scientific establishment, though. He specifically corresponded with Carl Nägeli, who was one of the most prominent botanists of the era.
And Nägeli totally blows him off.
All right. Well, worse than blowing him off, Nägeli actively guides him into a brick wall.
What do you mean?
Nägeli couldn't understand Mendel's statistics at all, and he pushed Mendel to replicate his pea plant findings using hawkweed, which was a plant they were both studying.
Oh, no. I know where this goes, and I feel so bad for Mendel.
Yeah. Mendel spent years meticulously crossbreeding hawkweed, expecting to see his beautiful 3-to-1 ratios. But instead, the results were chaotic.
Just totally random.
The offspring didn't follow the laws of segregation at all. Many were just identical copies of the mother plant. Mendel was baffled, and he actually began to doubt his own universal laws.
But the failure had absolutely nothing to do with his math, right?
None whatsoever. It took decades for science to discover that many species of hawkweed reproduce asexually. They are apomictic.
Let's break down apomictic so we really understand how unfair this was. What is happening mechanically in that plant?
Mechanically, an apomictic plant produces seeds that are genetic clones of the mother. It completely bypasses fertilization.
So the pollen doesn't even matter.
Exactly. Mendel was trying to study the shuffling of the genetic deck, but hawkweed wasn't shuffling the cards. It was just handing him a photocopy of the mother's hand every single time.
Wow.
He inadvertently stumbled onto an evolutionary loophole that bypassed the very laws of sexual reproduction he had just discovered.
The father genetics just cannot catch a break. I mean, his peers ignore his math. He accidentally spends years studying secret clones. And we haven't even talked about the killer bees.
Oh, the bees.
Right. Mendel eventually pivots to breeding bees in custom hives. He imports Cyprian and Carniolan bees to study their traits, but the resulting hybrids were so aggressive they literally terrorized the other monks and visitors to the abbey.
Yeah, it was a
He
disaster.
was forced to get rid of them.
And he was genuinely heartbroken about it. He affectionately referred to them in his notes as my dearest little animals.
I just picture this brilliant, isolated guy surrounded by cloned weeds and aggressive bees,
Yeah.
just watching the scientific world pass him by.
Yet despite all the setbacks, he possessed this quiet, unshakable confidence in his data.
Did he?
Yeah, he reportedly told a friend, my time will come. He knew the math was pristine, even if the biologists of his era lacked the training to understand it.
And his time certainly did come. In 1900, which is roughly 35 years after his paper was published, 3 different scientists, Hugo de Vries, Karl Correns, and Erich von Schermach, were independently researching inheritance. And they dig into the literature and all realized this obscure Moravian friar had beaten them to the punch by decades.
And that rediscovery ushers in the modern age of genetics. But the narrative takes another incredible turn here.
Right.
Decades later, the very mathematical perfection that made Mendel's work so brilliant birthed a massive scientific scandal.
Let's get into the Mendelian paradox. It's 1936, and this prominent statistician, R.A. Fisher, decides to run a modern analysis on Mendel's original pea plant data.
Yeah.
He looks at those famous 3-to-1 ratios and basically accuses the father of genetics of scientific fraud.
Fisher really drops a bomb on the scientific community. He argues that Mendel's results were implausibly close to the expected 3-to-1 ratio.
Because nature is messy.
Exactly. When you are dealing with living organisms, you expect biological noise. Think of flipping a coin. If you flip it 100 times, the expected ratio is 50 heads and 50 tails.
Right.
But if you actually run the experiment, you're much more likely to get 52 and 48, or maybe 49 and 51.
Getting exactly 50-50 is highly suspicious.
Right. And Fisher analyzed Mendel's massive data sets and declared the numbers were simply too perfect to be natural. He called the data abominable, shocking, and cooked.
Well, I have to push back on Fisher here. How does a statistician sitting in an office in the 1930s look at data collected in a monastery garden in the 1860s and declare a man cooked the books? Isn't it possible Mendel was just unbelievably meticulous?
That tension is exactly what scholars have debated for nearly a century now. On one hand, Mendel's character was universally described as fastidious and deeply honest.
Right.
On the other hand, the math, as Fisher ran it, looked artificially smoothed, which led to several theories attempting to explain the paradox.
What are the main theories? Because outright malicious fraud just seems wildly out of character.
One prominent theory is confirmation bias. The idea is that when Mendel or his assistants encountered ambiguous peas, say a pea that was yellowish-green, they unconsciously categorized it into the pile that favored the expected mathematical outcome.
Oh, like, well, the math says we need another yellow one, and this looks yellow enough.
Precisely. Just that kind of subtle human bias. But another fascinating theory revolves around the ethics and pedagogy of 19th century scientific reporting.
What does that mean?
Some historians argue Mendel might have intentionally cleaned up his published data to make his broader point undeniable.
Oh, interesting.
Think about it. He was an outsider trying to break through the rigid cognitive paradigms of the scientific elite. If he presented messy, noisy data, those elitist botanists would have dismissed his entire framework.
So he might have simplified the numbers to force them to see the underlying law of nature. Like, I know the mechanism's real, so I'm going to polish the presentation so these arrogant academics can't use statistical noise as an excuse to ignore the truth.
Right.
I can almost sympathize with that. But does the scientific community today still think he faked it?
No, the modern consensus heavily rejects Fisher's accusations. Leading modern geneticists and statisticians, notably Daniel Hartle and Daniel Fairbanks, have extensively audited Fisher's claims.
Okay, and what did they find?
They argue that Fisher actually fundamentally misunderstood Mendel's experimental design. Fisher assumed Mendel tested every single plant in a specific, standardized way.
Which he didn't.
Right. Hartle and Fairbanks showed that Mendel's methods were likely quite different, which changes the statistical expectations completely.
That makes sense.
They conclude that the allegation of deliberate falsification is completely unsupported by evidence. Mendel's legacy remains scientifically pristine.
Man, I am incredibly relieved to hear that. The monk didn't cook the books.
No, he didn't.
But the tragedy of this whole timeline is that Mendel never lived to see any of this. He didn't see his laws rediscovered, he didn't see the birth of genetics, and he obviously wasn't around for the dramatic defense of his integrity.
Yeah.
In fact, his scientific career was actually ended by a promotion.
Yeah, in 1868, he was elevated to abbot of the monastery, and almost immediately he was buried under administrative duties.
Just totally bogged down.
The final years of his life were consumed by a bitter, exhausting dispute with the civil government over a new tax they imposed on religious institutions.
He fought the tax relentlessly, right?
Yeah. He absolutely refused to pay it, viewing it as an unjust overreach. The fight drained his energy, and he died in 1884 at the age of 61 from chronic nephritis.
Which brings us back to the fire from the start of our deep dive. To end that bitter tax dispute and clear the slate, the abbot who succeeded Mendel gathered up decades of his predecessor's personal papers, research notes, and data and just burned them all.
It is an unfathomable loss. Thankfully, the few papers he published survived in libraries across Europe, and the impact of those surviving ideas really shaped the 20th century.
How so?
Well, in the 1930s and 40s, scientists finally merged Mendel's discrete genetics with Darwin's theory of natural selection.
Oh, right.
That created what we call the modern synthesis. This union of ideas is the absolute bedrock of all modern life sciences.
But the sheer power of his ideas also led to some incredibly dark chapters, right? Like when political regimes decided empirical biology didn't match their ideology.
Yeah, that is a crucial part of his legacy. In the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China officially rejected Mendelian genetics. Instead, they adopted Lysenkoism.
Let's explore why a government would outlaw a proven biological law. Our sources point out that Lysenkoism appealed to Marxist ideology, right? But what made it appealing?
Well, Lysenkoism argued that traits acquired during a plant's lifetime could be passed down to its offspring. It completely rejected the idea of fixed, unchangeable genes.
Okay, so how does that tie into their politics?
According to the sources, if you believe society can mold the perfect communist citizen through environment and hard work, the idea that certain traits are permanently hardwired into an organism's DNA feels deterministic.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it was viewed as politically threatening.
So if fixed genetics threatens the state's philosophy, the state simply outlaws the genetics.
And with devastating consequences, Mendelian geneticists in those countries were fired, imprisoned, or even executed for teaching empirical science.
That is awful.
Furthermore, agricultural policies were redesigned around this flawed non-Mendelian pseudoscience. Crops were planted based on ideological wishes rather than biological reality.
And that didn't work.
No, it contributed to massive, catastrophic famines in both countries. It really stands as a chilling historical reminder of the extreme human cost when state ideology attempts to override empirical truth.
It's like a geopolitical butterfly effect.
Yeah.
I mean, an idea born from counting peas in an Austrian abbey provides the foundation for modern medicine, but its rejection contributes to ideological wars and famine in the 20th century.
Yeah, his work was never just about vegetables. He was mapping the source code of all living things.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, just think about the sheer scale of this journey. From a working-class kid struggling to pay for school to an abbey garden through decades of obscurity, surviving the ashes of a bureaucratic fire, all the way to the 2025 mapping of the exact gene mutations he theorized. And it really came full circle recently, didn't it?
It did.
In 2021, to celebrate his 200th birthday, scientists actually exhumed Mendel's remains and sequenced his DNA.
It's the ultimate poetic tribute. The founder of genetics being analyzed by the very tools his theories made possible.
Did they find anything interesting?
They discovered, among other things, that he carried genetic variants predisposing him to heart problems and kidney disease.
The invisible factors inside the man himself finally brought to light.
Yeah.
But I want to leave you with one final haunting thought. We know Mendel was an insatiable polymath. We know he founded meteorological societies and meticulously tracked the weather.
Right.
He was crossbreeding mice. He was studying astronomy. And we know he was doing complex behavioral breeding with those aggressive bees. Now, considering that his successor burned all of his personal notebooks just to clean off a desk, what other world-changing scientific breakthroughs might have been sitting in those ashes?
Yeah.
What other fundamental laws of nature did that obscure, brilliant monk discover, only for them to be lost forever to the flames?